My name is Sandra Fitzpatrick. I'm 50 years old, and the day I found my daughter and granddaughter living under a bridge while my son-in-law vacationed in Australia changed everything I thought I knew about evil. I almost drove past them. It was a Thursday morning, cold and gray, and I was heading home from a routine doctor's appointment in Boulder. The bridge on the east side of town, I'd driven under it 1,000 times without a second thought. But that morning, something made me glance to the right, and there, huddled against the concrete pillar, wrapped in filthy blankets, was my daughter, Rebecca. My 28-year-old daughter, holding my 2-year-old granddaughter, Emma, living under a bridge. My hand started shaking so violently I nearly crashed the car. I slammed on the brakes, pulled over with tires screeching, and ran. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode right there. "Rebecca!" I screamed, stumbling over trash and broken glass. "Rebecca, oh my God, what happened?" She looked up at me with empty eyes. Empty. Like someone had reached inside her and scooped out everything that made her my daughter. "Hi, Mom," she said. Flat. Emotionless. Like we were running into each other at the grocery store. Not under a bridge where she was homeless with my grandbaby. Emma was shivering in her arms, her little face pale and thin, her eyes too big for her head. I grabbed that baby and held her tight, feeling how cold she was through the thin, dirty clothes. "Get in the car," I told Rebecca. My voice didn't sound like mine. "Right now, we're leaving." Rebecca hesitated. For a moment, I thought she might refuse. But exhaustion won. She stood slowly, like an old woman, and followed me to the car. The drive home was silent except for my ragged breathing and the quiet sound of Rebecca crying. I didn't push. I couldn't. My mind was spinning with questions that all crashed into one horrifying realization. I had no idea this was happening. None. My daughter and granddaughter were living on the streets, and I didn't know. How long had they been there? Where was Paul, and why hadn't Rebecca called me? At home, I ran a hot bath for Emma while Rebecca stood in the doorway like a ghost. I washed my granddaughter carefully, seeing every rib, every bruise, every sign of neglect. I wrapped her in warm, clean towels and dressed her in an emergency outfit I grabbed from the 24-hour store down the street. Fed her warm soup and watched her eat like she hadn't seen food in days. Because she probably hadn't. Only after Emma finally fell asleep, truly, deeply asleep, did Rebecca speak, and what she told me made my blood run cold. This is a long and painful story, and I need you with me to see it through to the end. If you want to know how a mother fights back when the system fails her daughter, follow along here, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. It started with Paul convincing Rebecca to quit her job. That's what she told me as we sat in my living room that first night. Emma finally sleeping peacefully in the guest bedroom upstairs. Rebecca's hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking, just holding it like the warmth was the only real thing left in her world. "He said it made sense," Rebecca whispered, staring into the mug. Emma was 6 months old, and daycare was expensive. Paul made good money as a corporate attorney. He said I should focus on being a mom, that Emma needed me home. It sounded reasonable. I remember that conversation. Rebecca had called me, excited, talking about how Paul was so supportive, how lucky she was to have a husband who valued her role as a mother. I'd felt a tiny flutter of concern even that Rebecca loved her work as a graphic designer, but I'd pushed it down. I didn't want to be that mother-in-law, the one who saw problems everywhere. I should have trusted my gut. "At first, it was nice," Rebecca continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I got to spend time with Emma, watch her grow." But then Paul started making comments about how I dressed, about the friends I saw, about you. My chest tightened. "What about me?" He said you were a bad influence, that your materialistic values would ruin Emma, that you cared more about money than family. Rebecca's voice cracked. "He said you never really approved of him, that you were always judging us. He made it sound like staying close to you would damage our marriage." I felt like I'd been punched. "Rebecca, that's not—" "I know, Mom. I know that now." Tears streamed down her face. but he was so convincing. He'd point out little things, how you mentioned the cost of something, how you talked about your hotel career, how you lived in this big house. He twisted everything until I started to doubt myself. Until I started to think maybe he was right. That explained the distance. The phone calls that became shorter, less frequent. The holidays she suddenly couldn't make because Paul's family needed them. The way she'd seemed to fade from my life over the past 2 years, like someone slowly turning down the volume on a song. He isolated me from everyone, Rebecca said. My college friends, my work friends, you, anyone who might have noticed what was happening, anyone who might have helped me see clearly. I wanted to scream. I wanted to go find Pauline, but I needed to hear everything. I needed to understand the full picture of what this monster had done to my daughter. When did it get worse? I asked quietly. Rebecca's hands started shaking, tea sloshing in the mug. About 8 months ago, he started coming home late. Weekends, he'd disappear for hours, saying he had work emergencies. Then I found a charge on our credit card statement, a hotel room in Denver. When I asked him about it, he exploded. She flinched at the memory, and I reached over to take her hand. He said I was paranoid, crazy, that I was seeing problems that didn't exist because I was depressed and unstable from being home all day with Emma. He suggested I needed medication, therapy, that something was wrong with me. Rebecca looked at me with devastated eyes. He said it so many times, Mom, so convincingly. I started to believe him. I started to think maybe I was losing my mind. This is what abusers do. I knew that intellectually, but hearing it from my own daughter, seeing what it had done to her, it was different. It was real and horrible and happening to the person I loved most in the world. The hotel charge was for Kristen, Rebecca said bitterly, his assistant. 26 years old, blonde, ambitious. They'd been having an affair for almost a year. How did you find out? I saw a text message. He'd left his phone on the bathroom counter, and it lit up. Can't wait for our weekend away, baby. 2 more weeks and we'll be free. I confronted him, and that's when everything fell apart. Rebecca's voice went flat again. That same empty tone from under the bridge. This was the hard part. I could feel it coming. He told me he wanted a divorce, that he and Kristen were in love, that they wanted to start a life together, but he didn't want to lose his money in the divorce. Didn't want to pay alimony or child support. He said I'd been a stay-at-home mooch for 2 years and didn't deserve anything. My jaw clenched so hard, my teeth hurt. So he came up with a plan. Rebecca's laugh was bitter and broken. He's a lawyer, Mom. He knows exactly how the system works and how to manipulate it. He started building a case against me. For weeks, maybe months, he was collecting evidence that I was an unfit mother. What kind of evidence? Lies. All lies. Rebecca's voice shook with anger now. The first real emotion besides despair I'd heard from her. He edited videos from our home security cameras, took clips out of context to make it look like I was neglecting Emma. Once, I'd fallen asleep on the couch while Emma napped. I'd been up all night with her teething, and he filmed me, making it look like I was passed out drunk. Another time, Emma had gotten into the kitchen cabinets and made a mess while I was in the bathroom. He filmed the mess and Emma crying, but not me cleaning it up 30 seconds later. My heart was racing. This wasn't just cruel, this was calculated, premeditated. He created fake medical documents, Rebecca continued, reports from psychiatrists I'd never seen, diagnosing me with severe postpartum depression, psychotic episodes, violent tendencies. The doctors listed didn't even exist. I checked later. He just made them up, forged signatures, used official-looking letters. How is that even possible? He's a corporate attorney. Mom, he has connections. He knows people who can create documents, who can make things look legitimate, and he knew I had no resources to fight back. No job, no money of my own, no support system because he'd isolated me from everyone. This wasn't just betrayal. This was destruction. Systematic, intentional destruction of my daughter's entire life. 3 weeks ago, police showed up at the house with a temporary restraining order, Rebecca said, her voice breaking, based on Paul's falsified evidence, claiming I was a danger to Emma and to him. They removed us from our own home. Just like that. 30 minutes to pack whatever we could carry, with Emma screaming and terrified. Not understanding why strangers were making us leave. I couldn't breathe. I literally couldn't catch my breath. Paul had already emptied our joint bank account, all $340,000 we'd saved, canceled every credit card with my name on it. I had nothing. No money, no home, nowhere to go. Tears poured down Rebecca's face. I tried to call you, Mom. I swear I tried. But every call went straight to a message saying the call couldn't be completed. I thought, I thought you'd blocked me. That Paul had been right all along, that you didn't really care. Rebecca, no, he'd blocked your number on my phone without me knowing, she said. Diverted all your calls, made sure I couldn't reach you and you couldn't reach me. Complete isolation. That was part of his plan. I felt sick, physically sick. While my daughter was being terrorized, I'd been leaving voicemail after voicemail, sending text after text, thinking she was ignoring me, thinking maybe she really had chosen Paul over me. I thought about going to a shelter, Rebecca continued. But Paul had threatened me, said if I involved social services, they'd take Emma away from me because of my mental health issues and instability. He said he had documentation, legal proof, that I was dangerous. I was terrified they'd believe him, so I just tried to survive, found places to sleep where we wouldn't be bothered, begged for food, kept Emma as safe and warm as I could. And Paul? I asked, though I already knew the answer would make me want to commit violence. Rebecca pulled out a phone, not hers, she explained, but a borrowed one from someone at a shelter she'd briefly visited. She opened Instagram and showed me Paul's account, photos of him and Kristen on a beach in Australia, swimming in crystal clear water, holding champagne glasses at a 5-star resort, kissing at sunset with the Sydney Opera House in the background. The caption on the most recent photo read, "Living my best life with my best girl. New beginnings," posted 2 days ago, while his wife and daughter slept under a bridge. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, at the hollows under her eyes, the way her clothes hung on her frame, the defeat in her posture. Then I looked at those photos of Paul, smiling and tanned and triumphant. And something in me shifted, something fundamental and irreversible. Rebecca, I said, my voice steady and cold, listen to me very carefully. Paul made one critical mistake. She looked at me with those empty eyes. He underestimated what a mother will do for her child. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd had saved 4 years but never needed to use. Lisa Chun's office. The receptionist answered. "This is Sandra Fitzpatrick," I said. "I need to speak with Lisa immediately. It's an emergency involving custody, fraud, and domestic abuse." Rebecca stared at me. "Mom, what are you? We're going to destroy him," I said simply. "Legally, financially, publicly, we're going to use every resource I have, every connection, every dollar if necessary. And when we're done, Paul Grayson is going to regret the day he ever met our family." For the first time since I'd found her under that bridge, I saw a spark of something in my daughter's eyes. Hope. Lisa Chun called me back within 20 minutes. I'd known Lisa for almost 15 years, ever since she'd handled the estate planning after Thomas died. She was sharp, ruthless when she needed to be, and she had a reputation in Colorado for absolutely destroying abusive spouses in court. When I explained what Paul had done, the falsified documents, the stolen money, Rebecca and Emma under that bridge, I heard her voice go cold in a way that actually comforted me. She told me she'd be at my house first thing in the morning with her investigator, and that I should prepare Rebecca to go through everything, every detail, no matter how painful. She also told me something that made my stomach drop. She said we were racing against time because Paul would be back from Australia in 10 days. And once he returned, he'd likely escalate. Men like him didn't just walk away. They tightened their control. That night, after Rebecca finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, I couldn't rest. I kept thinking about those fake medical documents Paul had created, about how easily he'd manipulated the system, about how close I'd come to never knowing, to losing my daughter and granddaughter forever into some horrible crack in the world where people just disappeared. I got up at 3 in the morning and started going through everything I had. Bank statements, property records, Insurance documents. I pulled out the folder of papers Rebecca had managed to grab when the police forced her out of her house. Most of it was Emma's birth certificate, some family photos, a few random bills, but tucked in the back was something that made my blood run cold all over again. A credit card statement in Paul's name. Rebecca must have grabbed it without really looking at what she was taking. And this statement showed charges I couldn't believe. The Australia trip. Obviously flights, resorts, activities, all for 2 people. But there were other things. A jewelry purchase for $8,000 at a high-end boutique in Denver. Multiple charges at expensive restaurants, always for 2 people. Hotel rooms in cities where Paul supposedly had work conferences, but the charge that made me stop breathing was from a real estate attorney's office in Aspen. $15,000, dated 6 weeks ago, with a memo line that read, "Property consultation fee." Paul was buying property with Kristen. While Rebecca was pregnant with his financial destruction, he was literally building a new life with his mistress. I took photos of every page with my phone, my hands shaking with rage. Lisa arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with a man she introduced as Marcus Webb, a private investigator who specialized in family law cases. Marcus was in his 50s, gray hair, quiet demeanor, but his eyes were sharp and calculating. He set up a laptop at my dining room table and started taking notes while Lisa sat with Rebecca, gently walking her through everything again, this time recording it all legally. I made coffee and breakfast, keeping Emma entertained in the living room while they worked. My granddaughter was already looking better, color in her cheeks, playing with toys I'd bought the day before, but she was clingy and quiet, traumatized, too young to understand what had happened but old enough to know her world had shattered. Marcus asked Rebecca if Paul had any home security cameras. When she confirmed he'd installed an expensive system throughout the house about a year ago, something shifted in Marcus's expression. He asked her if she knew the brand, the company that monitored it. She did, and that's when Marcus smelled a grim, satisfied smile that told me he'd just found something important. He explained that those security systems stored footage in the cloud. Everything was backed up, usually for 90 days or more, depending on the subscription. If Paul had edited videos to frame Rebecca, the original unedited footage would still exist in the cloud storage, and with the right legal pressure and Rebecca's name on the home ownership documents, we could access it all. Lisa was already on her phone, filing emergency motions. But Marcus wasn't done. He asked Rebecca about Paul's social media habits, his friends, his routines. Then he asked something that seemed odd at the time. He asked if Paul was the type of person who needed validation, who needed people to see his success and admire him. Rebecca laughed bitterly and said Paul lived for appearances. He posted constantly, documented everything, needed everyone to know how successful and happy he was. Marcus nodded like that was exactly what he wanted to hear. Over the next 2 days, Marcus worked like a machine. He obtained the cloud security footage through an emergency court order, and what he found was even worse than we'd imagined. Hours and hours of video showing Rebecca being a completely normal, loving, attentive mother, Emma laughing, playing, being fed and bathed and cared for beautifully. And then the edited clips Paul had created taking 3-second moments out of context from hours of normal daily life. One clip showed Emma crying while Rebecca was nowhere in frame, suggesting abandonment. The full video showed Rebecca had simply stepped into the next room for 30 seconds to grab a diaper, and Emma had gotten startled by the dog barking. Paul had cut out everything except those 30 seconds of crying. Another clip showed their kitchen in complete disarray, food on the floor, Emma with what looked like bruises on her arm. The edited version looked like evidence of severe neglect. The full video showed it was a normal toddler mess from lunchtime. And the bruises were actually just smudges of blueberry that Rebecca cleaned off immediately afterward while laughing and playing with Emma. It was systematic character assassination, carefully constructed over months. But Marcus found something even more damning. Emails. Hundreds of them, between Paul and Kristen, going back almost 18 months. And these emails laid out their entire plan in writing. Paul had told Kristen he needed to get rid of Rebecca without losing money in a divorce. Kristen had actually researched how to do it, sending Paul articles about parental alienation, false accusations, and legal manipulation. They discussed the fake medical documents, with Kristen offering to help create them through a connection she had at a printing company. In one email, dated just 6 weeks before Rebecca was forced out of her home, Paul had written to Kristen about how he was looking forward to their life together once he'd disposed of what he called the baggage. He'd actually used that word, baggage, for his wife and daughter. Kristen had responded with laughing emojis and a comment about how they'd celebrate in Australia once it was all done. I had to leave the room when Marcus showed us that email. I went upstairs to the bathroom and sobbed with rage until my throat was raw. When I came back down, Lisa was on her phone again, this time with someone from the district attorney's office. I heard her using words like fraud, forgery, criminal conspiracy. Marcus was scrolling through Paul's Instagram, screenshotting every single photo from the Australia trip, every smug caption about new beginnings and living his best life. He turned his laptop toward me, showing me a split screen he'd created. On the left, photos of Paul and Kristen on the beach, at expensive restaurants, holding cocktails and smiling. On the right, photos I'd taken of Rebecca and Emma under that bridge, dirty, cold, terrified. The contrast was so stark, so viscerally horrifying, that I knew immediately it would destroy Paul in court. No jury, no judge, no reasonable human being could look at those images side by side and not feel exactly what I was feeling: absolute disgust. But Marcus wasn't finished. He'd traced the money Paul had stolen from the joint account. All $340,000 had been transferred to a new account in Paul's name only, opened 3 months before he'd executed his plan. From there, large portions had been moved into investments. Some had purchased that property in a Spona mountain cabin worth $700,000, titled in Paul's name, with Kristen listed as a co-owner rent. The rest had funded their lifestyle while Rebecca starved on the streets. Lisa looked at me across the table, and I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. Pure, cold determination. She told me we had enough to bury Paul, not just in civil court, but criminal. The falsified documents alone were multiple felonies. Add in the fraud, the theft, the conspiracy, with Kristen, and Paul was looking at serious prison time. His legal career would be over. Everything he'd built would crumble. But she also told me something else. She said Paul had one advantage we needed to eliminate. He still believed Rebecca was powerless, isolated, broken. He believed he'd won. That arrogance would make him sloppy, confident, unlikely to hide evidence or prepare a defense. We had 8 days before he returned from Australia. 8 days to build an ironclad case that would hit him like a freight train the moment he stepped off that plane. That night, after Lisa and Marcus left with boxers of evidence and files, after Emma was asleep and Rebecca had taken medication to help her rest, I sat alone in my living room staring at those side-by-side photos Marcus had created. Paul thought he'd destroyed my daughter. He thought he'd won. He had no idea what was coming for him. Paul called Rebecca on the 7th day. She was in my kitchen helping me make lunch for Emma when her phone, the old one Paul hadn't known she'd kept in a drawer, now reactivated with a new number, buzzed with a call from an unknown international number. Rebecca's whole body went rigid. She looked at me with terror in her eyes, and I knew immediately who it was. Lisa had prepared us for this. She'd told Rebecca that Paul would likely reach out before returning, probably to make sure his story was still intact, that Rebecca was still under his control. Lisa had been very clear about what Rebecca needed to do. Answer the call, act defeated. Give him nothing that would make him suspicious. Play the role he expected. Rebecca answered on speaker so I could hear her voice trembling in a way that was only partially an act. Paul's voice came through sunny and relaxed, like he was calling to chat about weekend plans. He told her he'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that she and Emma were staying with me, and wasn't that nice that I'd finally decided to help out. The way he said it made it sound like I'd been withholding assistance, like he was graciously acknowledging my contribution. The audacity made my hands clench into fists. He told Rebecca he'd be back in 2 days and they needed to talk about their situation moving forward. He said he'd been thinking about things during his trip, and maybe they could work out an arrangement that would be better for everyone. His tone was so reasonable, so measured, like he was discussing a business negotiation and not the systematic destruction of his wife's life. Rebecca played her part perfectly. She asked him in a small, broken voice if he would consider letting her see Emma more than the supervised visits he'd mentioned before. She sounded desperate, defeated, exactly what Paul wanted to hear. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice when he responded. He told her that if she was reasonable and didn't cause problems, they could work something out. Maybe she could see Emma a few times a week if she proved she was stable. But she needed to understand that he had full legal custody now, that the courts had seen the evidence of her instability. And she was lucky he was being generous enough to offer anything at all. Then he said something that made my blood boil. He told Rebecca he hoped this experience had taught her about consequences, about what happens when wives don't appreciate what they have. He said maybe if she'd been more supportive, more grateful for the life he'd provided, things wouldn't have fallen apart like this. He was actually trying to make this her fault, rewriting history in real time, gaslighting her, even now. Rebecca's voice cracked when she thanked him for being willing to talk, for giving her another chance. She asked if they could meet when he got back, maybe at a coffee shop to discuss things calmly. Paul agreed, sounding magnanimous. He told her he'd text her a time and place once he landed. Then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his lawyer would probably need to be present at any meeting, just to make sure everything was documented properly. For her protection, he said. To make sure there were no misunderstandings. The call ended with Paul telling Rebecca to take care of herself and Emma, his tone dripping with false concern. Rebecca stood frozen for a long moment after hanging up, then ran to the bathroom and threw up. I held her hair back while she sobbed into the toilet, telling her over and over that it was almost over, that she'd done exactly what needed to be done. But inside, I was shaking with rage at what Paul had just revealed. He was bringing his lawyer to their meeting, which meant he was planning something else, some new manipulation or legal trap. He wasn't offering Rebecca an olive branch. He was setting up his next move. I called Lisa immediately and played her the recording. Rebecca had recorded the whole call on my phone. Lisa was quiet for a moment after listening, and when she spoke, her voice had that cold edge again. She told me that Paul suggesting his lawyer be present at an informal meeting was actually a huge tactical error. It showed he was planning to use anything Rebecca said as evidence for future proceedings, probably to further restrict her access to Emma or to paint her as difficult and unstable. But what he didn't know was that we'd be recording everything too, with proper legal authorization this time, and his own words would become evidence against him. Lisa said she'd have Marcus do one more sweep of Paul's digital footprint before he returned, and she'd file additional motions that would be served the moment he stepped back into Colorado. She also told me something that sent chills down my spine. She said the district attorney's office had reviewed the evidence and was preparing criminal charges, but they wanted to wait until Paul was back on U.S. soil to arrest him. They didn't want to risk him fleeing. The next day, Marcus called with information that changed everything. He'd been monitoring Paul's Instagram, watching as Paul posted more photos from his last days in Australia. But Marcus had noticed something in the background of one recent photo. Paul and Kristen at a restaurant, kissing over champagne. Behind them, partially visible on the table, was what looked like a document folder with a legal firm's logo. Marcus had enhanced the image, zoomed in, and identified the firm. It was an Australian family law practice specializing in international custody cases. Paul was consulting with lawyers in Australia about keeping Emma there. He was planning to take her out of the country. My heart stopped. Lisa immediately filed emergency motions to flag Emma's passport in Paul's custody claim, alerting border control and international authorities. If Paul tried to take Emma anywhere, every alarm in the system would go off. But this discovery revealed something even more sinister about Paul's plan. He hadn't just wanted Rebecca out of the way temporarily. He'd wanted her destroyed so thoroughly that he could take Emma to another country, start completely over with Kristen, and make sure Rebecca could never find them. He'd been planning to erase his daughter's mother from existence. When Rebecca learned this, something in her face changed. The fear was still there, but underneath it, I saw something harder. Anger. Real, burning anger. She looked at me and said she wanted to face him. She wanted to be there when he realized he'd lost, when everything came crashing down on him. She wanted him to see her standing strong when it all fell apart. Lisa warned us that the confrontation would be brutal, that seeing Paul would be traumatic for Rebecca. But she also said that if Rebecca could handle it, her testimony would be powerful. Seeing the victim face her abuser, showing the judge and jury that Rebecca had survived and was fighting back it, would be devastating to Paul's defense. Rebecca said she could handle it. She said she had to. The night before Paul's return, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that phone call, about the casual cruelty in his voice, the way he'd tried to convince Rebecca that her own destruction was her fault. I thought about those emails where he'd called his wife and daughter baggage. I thought about Emma sleeping under that bridge while he sipped champagne in Australia, and I thought about the morning after tomorrow, when Paul would step off that plane expecting to continue his perfect new life, completely unaware that everything was about to explode. Marcus had positioned photographers at the airport. We'd have images of Paul and Kristen arriving back together, tanned and happy and smiling, just hours before the police arrested them both. The contrast would be perfect. The evidence undeniable. The outcome inevitable. Paul had played his game thinking he was the only player who knew the rules. What he didn't understand was that he'd never been playing against Rebecca. He'd been playing against a mother who had resources, connections, and absolutely nothing to lose. And in that game, Paul had already lost. He just didn't know it yet. Lisa called an emergency meeting at her office the morning Paul was scheduled to land. She'd received something overnight that she said we needed to see before anything else happened. When Rebecca and I arrived, Emma, staying with a trusted neighbor who'd been vetted and cleared by Lisa, Marcus was already there. His laptop open, his expression grim. What they showed us made everything we'd discovered so far look almost merciful by comparison. Marcus had finally cracked into Paul's personal email account, the one he used for private correspondence separate from work. And buried in that account, in a folder Paul thought was secure, were emails between him and his father, Richard Grayson. I'd met Richard exactly twice. Once at Rebecca and Paul's wedding, where he'd given a toast about family legacy and the importance of producing heirs. The second time, at Emma's first birthday, where he'd made uncomfortable comments about Emma being a beautiful girl who'd someday make a good match. Both times, I'd found him cold and controlling, but I'd written it off as generational differences. I'd been wrong. The emails between Paul and his father went back years, starting before Paul had even married Rebecca, and they revealed something that made my stomach turn. Richard Grayson came from old money, the kind of family that measured worth in bloodlines and breeding. He'd established a trust fund for Paul worth approximately $4 million, but there was a condition: Paul had to produce a legitimate male heir by age 35 to access the full amount. If he only had daughters, he'd receive a reduced sum. If he had no children, the money would skip to Richard's brother's family line. Paul was Emma was a girl, and Rebecca had suffered complications during Emma's birth that made future pregnancies high risk and unlikely. In the emails, Richard had been pressuring Paul for months about the heir situation. He'd told Paul that Emma was lovely, but ultimately insufficient for the family's needs. He'd suggested that Paul needed to secure a new wife who could provide proper heirs, and that he needed to do it quickly before the trust deadline passed on Paul's 35th birthday, which was in 4 months. Richard had actually helped Paul plan Rebecca's destruction. He'd connected Paul with the people who created the fake medical documents. He'd advised Paul on how to structure the financial fraud to protect assets. He'd even suggested the Australian property purchase as a way to move money offshore where Rebecca couldn't touch it. But the worst email was dated 3 months ago. Paul had written to his father expressing concern about the moral implications of what they were doing, about whether destroying Rebecca's life was really necessary. Richard's response was chilling. He'd told Paul that women like Rebecca were ultimately expendable, that she'd served her purpose by providing a child even if it was the wrong gender, and that Paul needed to think about his legacy and his family's future rather than getting sentimental about a failed marriage. He'd reminded Paul that the Grayson name had been built on making hard decisions, and this was just another business transaction. Richard had also written something that made the entire conspiracy suddenly make horrible sense. He'd told Paul that once Rebecca was disposed of properly, those were his exact words, disposed of properly, Paul could marry Kristen, who came from a good family and was young enough to provide multiple children. Richard had already done background research on Kristen's family, checking their lineage, their health history, their financial standing. He'd been vetting her like livestock. The emails revealed that Richard had been funding Paul and Kristen's relationship, paying for their hotels and trips, viewing it as an investment in securing the proper heir. The Australia vacation was actually Richard's gift to them, his way of rewarding Paul for successfully removing Rebecca from the picture, and Richard had promised that once Paul had a son, he'd use his connections to ensure that Rebecca would never be able to challenge the custody arrangement, even suggesting that with the right legal pressure and falsified evidence, they could eventually have Rebecca declared incompetent and strip her of all parental rights permanently. They weren't just trying to sideline Rebecca. They were planning to erase her completely and legally, treating her like a defective appliance that needed to be replaced. Lisa's hands were shaking when she closed the laptop. She told us that these emails changed everything. This wasn't just a case of a man having an affair and treating his wife cruelly. This was a multi-generational conspiracy to commit fraud, to destroy a woman's life and steal her child, all for money and some twisted idea of family legacy. Rebecca sat in silence, her face pâle. I could see her mind working, processing the fact that Paul hadn't just stopped loving her or found someone new. He'd never valued her as a human being at all. She'd been a means to an end, a vessel for children. And when she'd produced the wrong gender and couldn't safely have more, she'd become garbage to be disposed of. But something else was in those emails that gave us a weapon I hadn't expected. Richard Grayson was a prominent figure in Denver society. He sat on the boards of 3 major corporations, chaired several charitable foundations, and had his name on a wing of the city's art museum. His reputation was built on being a pillar of the community, a family man who valued traditional morals and ethical business practices. If these emails became public, if the world saw Richard Grayson conspiring to destroy a young mother and steal her child for the sake of a trust fund and an obsession with male heirs, his entire legacy would crumble. Every board would remove him. Every charity would distance itself. His family name, which he valued above everything, would become synonymous with cruelty and corruption. Lisa looked at me with something like awe in her expression. She said this evidence didn't just give us leverage over Paul, it gave us leverage over the entire Grayson family and all their resources. Marcus added something that made me smile for the first time in days. He said that Richard Grayson's brother, though, one who would inherit the trust if Paul failed to produce a male heir, was actually a decent man who'd been estranged from Richard for years over ethical disagreements. Marcus had already reached out to him quietly, and the brother had been horrified to learn what Richard and Paul were doing. The brother had agreed to testify if needed and to provide information about the trust's terms and Richard's character. The Grayson family was about to go to war with itself, and we'd be armed with the truth. But there was one more thing in those emails that broke my heart. Paul had written to his father about Emma, saying she was a sweet child but ultimately a disappointment. He'd asked Richard if there was any way to structure the trust to count Emma as sufficient, and Richard had flatly refused, saying that changing the terms would set a dangerous precedent, and that Paul needed to accept that Emma was simply not valuable enough to the family legacy. They'd measured my granddaughter's worth and found her insufficient because she was born female. Rebecca read that email and started crying, deep wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Not for herself this time, but for Emma. For the fact that her daughter's own father and grandfather had calculated her value and decided she wasn't enough. I held Rebecca while she cried, and I made a decision. Paul and Richard Grayson had played their game by their rules, treating people like pawns in some dynasty-building strategy. They'd measured worth in money and gender and bloodlines, but they'd forgotten something fundamental. They'd forgotten that the woman they'd tried to destroy was loved by someone who had her own resources, her own determination, and absolutely no respect for their twisted value system. Richard wanted to protect his legacy. Paul wanted his trust fund and his new life. They'd been willing to destroy Rebecca and Emma to get what they wanted. Now they were going to learn what it costs to treat human beings like expendable assets. Lisa told us that Paul's plane was landing in 90 minutes. The police were ready. The warrants were signed. Marcus had photographers positioned at the airport and at Paul's house. And we had one more surprise, prepared something that would ensure not just legal justice, but social destruction. We'd leaked the story to a journalist friend of Lisa's who specialized in exposing wealthy family corruption. The story would break tomorrow morning, complete with those side-by-side photos of Paul in Australia and Rebecca under the bridge, along with excerpts from the emails showing the conspiracy between Paul and Richard. By the time the legal proceedings even started, public opinion would have already convicted them both. Rebecca looked at me with red, swollen eyes and asked if this made us as bad as them, if destroying their reputations and their lives made us cruel to them. I thought about that question. I thought about Emma sleeping under a bridge, about Rebecca being gaslit and isolated and terrorized, about two grown men sitting in comfortable offices, writing emails about disposing of a woman properly like she was trash. And I told Rebecca the truth. Justice isn't about being nice. Sometimes justice means making sure that people who cause suffering face real consequences, not just legal slaps on the wrist that they can buy their way out of. Paul and Richard had used their money and connections and power to destroy her life. We were going to use the truth to destroy theirs. That wasn't cruelty. That was balance. Paul's plane landed at Denver International Airport at 2:15 in the afternoon. Marcus sent me a text message with a single photo attachment. Paul and Kristen walking through the terminal, tanned and smiling, pulling expensive luggage behind them. They looked like any other couple returning from a dream vacation, relaxed and happy. Paul had his arm around Kristen's waist. She was laughing at something he'd said. They had no idea what was waiting for them outside. But before Paul even made it to baggage claim, something else happened that I hadn't anticipated. Something that would shift the entire balance of power in ways I couldn't have predicted. Lisa called me, and I could hear genuine surprise in her voice. She told me we had a visitor at her office who'd arrived unannounced 30 minutes ago, demanding to speak with her about the Grayson case. She said I needed to get there immediately and that I should bring Rebecca. The visitor was Paul's mother, Catherine Grayson. I'd met Catherine a handful of times over the years, always at family events where she'd seemed quiet and withdrawn, letting Richard dominate every conversation. She dressed impeccably, spoke softly when she spoke at all, and gave the impression of being a woman who'd learned long ago that silence was safer than having opinions. I'd felt sorry for her, the same way you feel sorry for decorative objects that serve no purpose but to look appropriate in the background. I'd been completely wrong about her too. Catherine was sitting in Lisa's conference room when Rebecca and I arrived, her posture perfect, her hands folded calmly in her lap. But her eyes were sharp and calculating, and I realized with a shock that this was a woman who'd been playing a very different game than anyone had suspected. Lisa closed the door behind us and gestured for us to sit. Catherine looked at Rebecca for a long moment, and I saw genuine regret in her expression. She told Rebecca she owed her an apology. She said she'd known for months that Paul was planning something terrible, that Richard had been pushing him toward it, and she'd tried to convince herself it wasn't as bad as she feared. She'd told herself that maybe Paul was just being dramatic in his complaints about Rebecca, that maybe there were problems in the marriage she didn't understand. But 3 weeks ago, she'd overheard a phone conversation between Richard and Paul. She'd heard them laughing about how Rebecca was probably sleeping in shelters by now, about how the plan had worked perfectly, about how Rebecca would be too broken to ever fight back. Catherine's voice cracked when she described hearing her husband and son laugh about a young mother and child being homeless. She said that was the moment she understood that she'd married a monster and raised another one. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't even known existed. The original trust agreement that Richard's father had created, with all its conditions about heirs and bloodlines, bank statements showing wire transfers from Richard to Paul's secret accounts, copies of Richard's correspondence with the people who'd created the fake medical documents including contracts and payment receipts. Catherine had been collecting evidence for 3 weeks, quietly copying documents from Richard's home office, forwarding emails to herself from his computer when he wasn't looking, photographing files and contracts. She'd built an entire parallel case against her own husband and son. Lisa was looking at the documents with something like AO. She told Catherine that this evidence was devastating, that it proved premeditation and conspiracy beyond anything we'd been able to establish definitively. With Catherine's testimony in these documents, Paul and Richard couldn't claim anything was a misunderstanding or poor judgment. This was calculated, planned, and executed with full knowledge of the harm it would cause. But then Catherine said something that made me understand why she was really there. She told us about Emma, about how she'd held her granddaughter at her first birthday party, watched her laugh and play, seen the way Rebecca cared for her with such obvious love. She said Emma was a beautiful, perfect child who deserved to grow up knowing she was valued, not treated like a disappointment because of her gender. Catherine's voice went cold when she said that Richard had told her recently that once Paul had a proper son with Kristen, Emma would be essentially irrelevant to the family. Richard had actually suggested they could let Rebecca have her back completely, since Emma would never be important to the Grayson legacy anyway. That was when Catherine had decided she was done protecting her husband's reputation or her son's future. She said she'd spent 30 years being the perfect society wife, staying quiet, looking appropriate, letting Richard make all the decision. She'd watched him treat their daughter, Paul's younger sister, who'd moved to Seattle specifically to get away from Richard's control with dismissive cruelty because she'd chosen career over marriage and children. Catherine said she'd made peace with her own life being small and constrained, but she would not stand by and watch her granddaughter be treated as worthless, and she would not let another woman be destroyed the way she'd been diminished over decades of marriage. Rebecca was crying silently, and I felt my own eyes burning. This woman had everything to lose: her marriage, her social standing, her financial security, and she was willing to throw it all away to do the right thing. Lisa asked Catherine if she understood what testifying would mean: the social consequences, the family fracture, the fact that Richard would likely divorce her and try to leave her with nothing. Catherine smiled, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from her. She said Richard could try, but she'd been preparing for this for 3 weeks. She'd moved money from their joint accounts into a separate account in her name only. She'd consulted with her own attorney. She'd documented 30 years of emotional abuse and financial control, and she'd already filed for divorce that morning, with papers being served to Richard later today. She said she'd been Richard's decorative wife for long enough. It was time to be Emma's grandmother and her own person instead. Lisa told Catherine that her testimony and evidence would be crucial for the criminal case against both Paul and Richard. With her cooperation, the prosecution could prove conspiracy, premeditation, and financial fraud beyond any reasonable doubt. Paul and Richard weren't just looking at civil penalties anymore. They were looking at serious prison time. Catherine said she understood. She said she wanted them to face real consequences. She wanted Paul to understand that his actions had costs, and she wanted Richard to know that his legacy is a thing he valued more than anything. More than his wife or children or basic human decency would be destroyed by his own cruelty. Then Catherine turned to Rebecca and said something I'll never forget. She said that Emma was lucky to have a mother who loved her enough to survive the worst thing imaginable. She said she hoped Rebecca would let her be part of Emma's life despite everything. Not as a Grayson representative, but just as a grandmother who wanted to know her grandchild and be better than she'd been before. Rebecca reached across the table and took Catherine's hand, and they sat there crying together for a moment. Two women who'd been hurt by the same family's twisted values, now allied against the men who'd caused that harm. Marcus texted again. Paul and Kristen had collected their luggage and were heading toward the exit where they'd arranged for a car service to pick them up. Police were in position. The arrest would happen in minutes. But now we had something I hadn't expected. We had someone from inside the Grayson family willing to testify, willing to expose Richard's role and provide evidence that Paul's actions weren't isolated but part of a larger pattern of treating women as expendable. Lisa's phone rang. It was the detective handling Paul's case. She put it on speaker so we could all hear. Paul had been arrested at the airport exit. Kristen had been taken into custody simultaneously. Both had been charged with multiple felonies: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, theft. They were being transported to the station for processing and would be arraigned tomorrow morning. The detective said Paul had been completely shocked, demanding to know what was happening, insisting there must be a mistake. Kristen had started crying immediately, asking if she could call her parents. Neither of them had seen it coming. They'd thought they'd won. Catherine stood up, smoothing her skirt with hands that barely trembled. She told Lisa she'd be available for any depositions or testimony needed, and that she'd be staying at a hotel downtown rather than returning to the house she'd shared with Richard. Before she left, she stopped in front of me. She said she knew I had no reason to trust her or believe she was sincere. She said she'd failed Rebecca by staying silent for so long, and she'd understand if Rebecca never wanted to see her again. But she hoped that maybe, after all this was over, she could have a chance to know Emma, to be the kind of grandmother who taught Emma that her worth had nothing to do with her gender or her usefulness to anyone else's plans. I looked at this woman who'd spent decades being silent and small, who'd finally found the courage to burn down everything she'd known to protect a grandchild she barely knew. And I told her the truth. I said Emma deserved every good person in her life she could have. And if Catherine was willing to stand up against her own husband and son for Emma's sake, then she'd already proven what kind of grandmother she'd be. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. She thanked me, squeezed Rebecca's hand one more time, and left. Lisa looked at the documents Catherine had left behind, spread across the conference table like a map of destruction. She said that with this evidence added to everything we already had, Paul's defense would crumble. There was no story he could tell, no explanation he could offer that would overcome the documented conspiracy and the testimony of his own mother. Richard Grayson would likely be charged as a co-conspirator. His reputation would be destroyed. His business relationships would evaporate. His legacy, the thing he'd valued above family, above decency, above human compassion, would become a cautionary tale about the cost of cruelty. Rebecca looked exhausted, but something had changed in her expression. She'd been so afraid for so long, so beaten down by Paul's manipulation, but now, watching Catherine walk away from everything to do the right thing, seeing the evidence stack up impossibly high against Paul and Richard, she was starting to believe that maybe this was really ending, that maybe she was really going to be free. I put my arm around my daughter and held her while Lisa made calls to the prosecutor's office. To Marcus, to the journalist who'd be breaking the story tomorrow. The pieces were all in motion now, an avalanche of consequences that Paul and Richard couldn't stop, even if they'd seen it coming. Paul was sitting in a holding cell right now, probably still trying to understand how his perfect plan had collapsed so completely. He'd thought he was playing against a broken, isolated woman with no resources and no hope. He'd never understood that he was playing against a mother with resources, a grandmother with determination, and his own mother who'd finally had enough of enabling evil. The game was over. Paul just didn't know how badly he'd lost yet. The story broke at 6 a.m. the next morning. I was already awake, sitting in my kitchen with coffee I wasn't drinking, waiting for my phone to start buzzing. Rebecca was upstairs sleeping. Lisa had given her medication to help her rest through the night, and Emma was still asleep in the room next to mine, peaceful and safe. The first notification came from a news alert. The headline read, "Prominent Denver attorney arrested for elaborate fraud scheme against wife and child." Below it was one of those side-by-side photos Marcus had created. Paul and Kristen on the beach in Australia, drinks in hand, smiling at the camera. Next to it, the photo I'd taken of Rebecca and Emma under the bridge, wrapped in dirty blankets, faces hollow with exhaustion. The contrast hit exactly as hard as we'd intended. My phone started ringing within minutes. Friends I hadn't spoken to in months, acquaintances from my hotel management days, even former colleagues who'd seen the story and recognized Rebecca's name. Everyone wanted to know if it was true, if that was really my daughter in the photo, if I needed anything. I let most calls go to voicemail, but when my neighbor called, the one who'd been watching Emma yesterday answered. She was crying. She told me she'd had no idea what Rebecca had been through, that seeing those photos had broken her heart, and that she'd be happy to help watch Emma anytime we needed. No charge, whatever we needed. That was the first crack in what would become a flood. By 8 a.m., the story had spread across social media. Local news had picked it up. By 9, national outlets were running pieces about the case. By 10, the photos had been shared thousands of times, and Paul's name was trending on social media alongside words like monster and sociopath. The journalist Lisa had worked with had done exactly what we'd hoped. She hadn't just reported the facts. She'd told Rebecca's story, the isolation, the manipulation, the falsified documents, the theft, the cruelty of being left homeless while Paul vacationed. She'd included excerpts from the emails between Paul and Richard about disposing of Rebecca properly, and Emma being insufficient because she was female. And she'd included a quote from Catherine Grayson, identified as Paul's mother and Richard's estranged wife, saying that she could no longer stay silent while her family destroyed innocent lives for money and pride. The public reaction was exactly what happens when people see evil laid bare in terms they can understand. Paul and Richard weren't abstract villains in a courtroom drama. They were real men who'd done specific, documented, photographable harm to a young mother and a toddler. People could see Rebecca's face, see Emma's frightened eyes, see Paul's smug vacation photos, and understand immediately what had happened. There was no ambiguity, no room for sympathy, just clear, undeniable cruelty. By noon, Richard Grayson had been removed from 2 corporate boards. By 2 p.m., 3 charities had announced they were returning his donations and removing his name from their donor lists. By 4, Polisi El Militar. The museum with his name on the wing had released a statement saying they were reviewing the naming agreement in light of recent revelations. Richard's entire legacy was crumbling in real time, exactly as Catherine had predicted. His name was becoming toxic, and everyone who'd ever associated with him was scrambling to distance themselves as fast as possible. Marcus called me in the afternoon with an update that made me actually laugh out loud. Paul's law firm had fired him immediately upon seeing the news, releasing a statement about being horrified and deceived. Several of Paul's former clients were now reviewing their cases to see if Paul had engaged in similar fraudulent behavior on their behalf. The State Bar Association had opened an investigation into whether Paul should be disbarred even before the criminal trial. Paul's professional life was over, his reputation destroyed, his future as an attorney eliminated, but the most satisfying call came from Lisa at 3 p.m. She told me that Paul's arraignment had happened that morning, and his attorney appointed by the court because Paul's own firm had dropped him had tried to argue for reasonable bail. The prosecutor had presented the evidence of the Australian property and the consultation with international custody lawyers, arguing that Paul was a flight risk with both motive and means to leave the country. The judge had denied bail entirely. Paul would stay in jail until trial. Lisa said Paul had actually looked shocked when the judge read the decision, like he still couldn't comprehend that this was really happening to him, that the system he'd manipulated so easily before was now working against him. Richard had also been arrested earlier that morning, charged as a co-conspirator in the fraud scheme. His bail had been set at $500,000, which he'd paid immediately. But his freedom wasn't going to last long. Catherine had already testified to the grand jury, providing all her documentation. Additional charges were being prepared, but Lisa called me for another reason beyond just updates. She said the prosecution wanted to meet with Rebecca tomorrow to prepare for the preliminary hearings and, eventually, the trial. They wanted her testimony to be powerful and clear, and they wanted to make sure she was emotionally ready to face Paul in court. Lisa asked me if I thought Rebecca could handle seeing Paul across a courtroom, having to recount everything he'd done while he sat there watching her. I thought about my daughter upstairs, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks because she finally felt safe. I thought about how she'd answered Paul's phone call and played her role perfectly, hiding her fear and anger. I thought about how she'd looked at me after learning about Richard's emails and said she wanted to face them both. I told Lisa that Rebecca was stronger than anyone, including Rebecca herself had realized that she'd survived something that should have destroyed her, that she'd protected Emma through hell, and that if she said she was ready to testify, then she was ready. Lisa said she'd arranged the meeting for tomorrow afternoon. She also told me something else. She said the prosecutor was considering offering Paul a plea deal, reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Richard and avoiding a lengthy trial. But the prosecutor wanted to know if Rebecca would prefer to see Paul face a full trial where she could testify publicly about what he'd done. I told Lisa I'd ask Rebecca when she woke up, but I already knew what she'd say. Rebecca didn't want a plea deal. She wanted Paul to face every consequence, to sit through a trial where evidence would be presented and witnesses would testify. She wanted him to hear his own mother describe his cruelty. She wanted a jury to see those photos and read those emails and decide his fate. She wanted justice, not convenience. That evening, after Emma was fed and bathed and playing with her toys in the living room, Rebecca came downstairs looking more rested than I'd seen her in months. She sat next to me on the couch and watched Emma for a long moment. Then she told me something I hadn't expected. She said she'd been thinking about Catherine all day, about the courage it took to walk away from everything and expose her own family. She said she'd decided she wanted Catherine to be part of Emma's life, that Emma deserved to have a grandmother who'd proven she could choose right over easy. She also said she'd been thinking about the trial, about the fact that in a few weeks or months, she'd have to sit in a courtroom and face Paul while describing the worst period of her life, about how he'd look at her and probably try to intimidate her or make her doubt herself even then. But she said she was ready, Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Emma growing up knowing that when terrible things happen, you fight back. You tell the truth. You don't let powerful people get away with cruelty just because fighting is hard. Rebecca said she wanted Emma to know that her mother hadn't stayed broken, that she'd stood up and faced her abuser and made sure he answered for what he'd done. I held my daughter while she cried, but these tears were different than the ones before. These weren't tears of fear or grief. These were tears of relief, of anger finally finding its voice, of a woman who'd been beaten down, starting to stand back up. Marcus sent another text late that evening. He'd been monitoring Paul's phone records and social media since the arrest. Paul had tried to call Kristen from jail. She'd declined the call. He'd tried to call several friends. None had answered. He'd tried to call his father. Richard's lawyer had advised him not to accept any calls from Paul. Paul was completely alone. Everyone he'd relied on had abandoned him. His lawyer was court-appointed and overworked. His mother had testified against him. His father was facing his own charges. His girlfriend had been arrested as his accomplice. His friends and colleagues had scattered. The isolation Paul had used as a weapon against Rebecca, cutting her off from everyone, making sure she had nowhere to turn, had become his own reality. The difference was that Rebecca had been innocent. Paul had earned every bit of his isolation through his own cruelty. Tomorrow, Rebecca would meet with the prosecutor and begin preparing for trial. In a few weeks, there would be preliminary hearings where evidence would be presented and witnesses would testify. Eventually, there would be a full trial where Paul and Richard would face all the charges, all the evidence, all the consequences. But tonight, in my house, Rebecca and Emma were safe and warm. Catherine had called earlier to check on them, her voice gentle and sincere. Lisa had assured us that the legal case was as strong as any she'd ever seen. Marcus was still documenting everything, building an unassailable record of what had happened. Everything was in position. Every piece of evidence secured. Every witness prepared. Paul had chosen the perfect moment to strike against Rebecca when she was isolated, vulnerable, without resources or support. He'd calculated every detail of his attack, ensuring she couldn't fight back. What he'd never considered was that his perfect moment would pass, that Rebecca would survive it, and that when she struck back, she wouldn't be alone or powerless. She'd be armed with the truth, supported by people who cared about justice, and backed by evidence that couldn't be disputed or explained away. Paul's perfect moment had become Rebecca's perfect storm, and it was about to destroy everything he'd built on lies and cruelty. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late October. I'd never been inside a criminal courtroom before. The space was smaller than I'd imagined, more cramped and institutional. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The judge's bench loomed dark and imposing. Everything felt designed to make you understand that this was serious, that what happened here had weight and permanence. Rebecca sat next to Lisa at the prosecution table, her hands folded in her lap, her posture straight. She'd dressed carefully, that morning, a simple navy dress, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back. She looked dignified and calm, but I could see her hands trembling slightly when she thought no one was watching. Catherine sat in the gallery next to me, her presence a quiet statement that the Grayson family wasn't unified behind Paul. Several journalists filled the back rows, along with people I didn't recognize, probably just citizens who'd followed the story and wanted to see justice happen in person. Then they brought Paul in. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. His hair wasn't styled the way he usually kept it. He looked tired and smaller somehow, like the confidence that had always surrounded him had been stripped away along with his expensive suits. When he saw Rebecca sitting at the prosecution table, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, something that might have been fear. He'd expected her to stay broken, to stay silent, to disappear. Seeing her there, ready to testify against him, must have been the moment he finally understood how completely he'd miscalculated. The judge entered and everyone stood. Judge Morrison was the same woman who'd handled the emergency custody motions. Her expression was severe as she looked down at the courtroom, her eyes lingering on Paul for a moment with clear distaste. The prosecutor stood and began laying out the charges: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, theft, domestic abuse through economic coercion. Each charge was explained in detail, with the prosecutor describing the evidence that supported it. Then she called her first witness, Marcus Webb. Marcus took the stand and methodically walked through his investigation. The security camera footage that Paul had edited versus the original unedited videos. The fake medical documents with non-existent doctors and forged signatures. The bank records showing Paul had transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars from the joint account to a secret account in his name only. Paul's attorney tried to object, tried to argue that the evidence had been obtained improperly, but Judge Morrison shut him down quickly. Everything had been obtained through proper legal channels with court orders. There was no procedural error to exploit. Then Marcus displayed the side-by-side photos on a screen visible to the entire courtroom. Paul and Kristen in Australia, laughing on the beach. Rebecca and Emma under the bridge, wrapped in filthy blankets. I heard someone in the gallery gasp. Judge Morrison's jaw tightened. Marcus explained the timeline in his calm, professional voice. Paul had taken those Australia photos on October 3rd. The photo of Rebecca and Emma under the bridge was taken October 5th. While Paul was parasailing and eating at five-star restaurants, his wife and daughter were sleeping on concrete and begging for food. The prosecutor then entered the emails between Paul and Richard into evidence. The court clerk read selected excerpts aloud, Paul's father advising him on how to structure the fraud, Richard connecting Paul with document forgers, the discussions about disposing of Rebecca properly, the comments about Emma being insufficient because she was female. Paul's face went pale as his own words, his own plans, were read aloud in an official courtroom record. There was no way to deny them, no way to claim they'd been misunderstood or taken out of context. The conspiracy was documented in explicit detail in Paul's own written words. Then the prosecutor called Catherine Grayson. I watched Paul's face as his mother took the stand. He looked genuinely shocked, like he'd believed until that moment that she'd never actually testify against him, that family loyalty would prevail, that she'd stay quiet, like she'd always stayed quiet. Catherine's testimony was devastating precisely because it was delivered so calmly. She didn't cry or show excessive emotion. She simply told the truth in a clear, steady voice. She testified about Richard's obsession with male heirs and family legacy, about the trust fund conditions and the pressure on Paul to produce a son, about overhearing Richard and Paul laugh about Rebecca being homeless, about Richard's explicit statements that Emma was worthless to the family because of her gender. She described going through Richard's office and finding contracts with the people who'd created the fake documents. She explained how Richard had wired money to Paul's secret account. She detailed conversations where Richard had advised Paul on how to structure the fraud to avoid detection. Paul's attorney tried to attack Catherine's credibility, suggesting she was a scorned wife, getting revenge on her husband and son. Catherine looked at him with something like pity and said she was simply a grandmother who refused to let an innocent child be treated as worthless and a young mother be destroyed for money. Judge Morrison actually nodded approvingly at that response. Then came the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating. The prosecutor called Rebecca to the stand. My daughter stood and walked to the witness box, her steps steady, despite the trembling I knew she must be feeling. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then she sat down and looked directly at Paul, for the first time since entering the courtroom. He tried to hold her gaze, probably attempting to intimidate her the way he'd intimidated her throughout their marriage, but Rebecca didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She just stared at him until he was the one who dropped his eyes. The prosecutor asked Rebecca to describe her marriage to Paul. Rebecca spoke clearly, describing how he'd isolated her from friends and family, how he'd convinced her to quit her job, how he'd gradually taken control of every aspect of her life. She described finding evidence of his affair with Kristen, his response when she confronted him, the way he'd twisted everything to make her doubt her own sanity. Then she described the day police came to remove her and Emma from their home based on Paul's falsified evidence, the terror of being forced out with only 30 minutes to pack, the confusion of trying to understand what was happening while Emma screamed in fear. Rebecca's voice cracked slightly when she described having no money, no resources, nowhere to go, trying to call me and believing I'd blocked her, believing she'd been abandoned by everyone. She described living under that bridge, the cold concrete, Emma's crying from hunger, the shame and fear that consumed every moment, the knowledge that her daughter was suffering and she couldn't fix it. The courtroom was completely silent except for Rebecca's voice. Even the journalists had stopped taking notes and were just listening. Then Rebecca described the morning I found them, the shock on my face, the immediate action to get them safe and warm, and the days that followed when everything Paul had built on lies began to crumble. The prosecutor asked Rebecca what she wanted to happen to Paul. Rebecca looked at him again, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. She said she wanted him to face every consequence of what he'd done. She wanted him to understand that people aren't disposable, that you can't destroy lives for convenience and money. She wanted him to know that his daughter would grow up learning that her worth wasn't determined by her gender or her usefulness to anyone's plan. And she wanted him to spend every day in prison thinking about the fact that he'd had a family who loved him, a daughter who deserved better, and he'd thrown it all away for a trust fund and a girlfriend. Paul's attorney tried to cross-examine Rebecca, tried to suggest she was exaggerating or seeking revenge, but everything she'd said was backed by documented evidence. The emails, the bank records, the falsified documents, the security footage, the photos. There was nothing to attack because Rebecca was simply telling the documented truth. Judge Morrison listened to closing arguments from both sides. Paul's attorney argued that while mistakes had been made, criminal charges were excessive, that this was essentially a domestic dispute that had gotten out of hand. The prosecutor responded by holding up the photo of Emma under the bridge and asking if the court really believed that forcing a 2-year-old to sleep on concrete while stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars through fraud was just a domestic dispute gone wrong. Judge Morrison didn't even need time to deliberate. She ruled immediately that there was more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial on all charges. She denied bail again, noting that Paul had already demonstrated intent to flee to Australia. And she issued a statement for the record saying that she'd seen many cases of domestic abuse in her courtroom, but the calculated cruelty and premeditation in this case was among the worst she'd encountered. Paul was led out of the courtroom back to jail. As he passed the prosecution table, he looked at Rebecca one more time. I saw him mouth something that looked like an apology or maybe a plea. Rebecca turned her head away. She was done listening to anything he had to say. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around us asking for statements. Lisa handled most of them professionally, explaining that justice was being served and that Rebecca was focused on healing and rebuilding her life with Emma. But one reporter asked Rebecca directly what she wanted people to take away from her story. Rebecca thought for a moment, then spoke in that same steady voice she'd used in the courtroom. She said she wanted people to understand that abuse doesn't always look like bruises and broken bones. Sometimes it looks like isolation and manipulation and financial control. Sometimes it's a lawyer using his knowledge of the system to destroy someone he promised to love. She said she wanted other women in similar situations to know that even when it feels impossible, even when you're at your lowest point, there's still hope. There are still people who will fight for you. There's still justice to be found. And she wanted Paul and men like him to understand that the women they try to dispose of aren't going to stay silent anymore. Catherine squeezed my hand as we walked to Lisa's car. She told me she was proud of Rebecca, that watching her testify had been one of the most powerful things she'd ever witnessed. She said Emma was lucky to have a mother with that kind of strength. I looked back at the courthouse, thinking about Paul sitting in his cell, finally understanding that his perfect plan had been destroyed by the same people he'd thought were too weak and powerless to fight back. Rebecca had stood in front of him and told the truth. Catherine had betrayed the family loyalty that was supposed to protect him. I'd used resources he'd assumed I wouldn't share. And now the system he'd manipulated so skillfully was crushing him with the weight of his own documented cruelty. The trial was still months away. There would be more hearings, more testimony, more opportunities for Paul's lawyers to try to find some crack in the case. But we all knew how it would end. The evidence was too strong. The testimony too damning. The documentation too complete. Po Hadlosti, he just didn't want to admit it yet. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, expert witnesses, and legal arguments. 3 weeks of watching Paul sit at the defense table with his court-appointed attorney, trying different strategies: denial, minimization, claiming he'd been manipulated by his father, suggesting Rebecca had exaggerated everything. None of it worked. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman read the verdict in a clear, unwavering voice. Guilty on all counts: fraud, forgery, conspiracy, theft, domestic abuse through economic coercion. Paul's face went completely blank when he heard the word guilty repeated over and over. Like his brain couldn't process that this was really his reality now. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. When that day came, she didn't hold back. She told Paul that she'd reviewed cases for over 20 years, and his calculated cruelty toward his own wife and child represented a betrayal of every value society holds dear. She said he'd used his legal knowledge as a weapon, corrupted the justice system for personal gain, and shown absolutely no remorse for the suffering he'd caused. She sentenced him to 12 years in prison. No possibility of parole for at least 8 years. Richard's trial came a month later, with Catherine's testimony and the documented evidence of his role in planning the conspiracy. His conviction was equally certain. He received 8 years, though given his age and health issues, everyone knew he'd likely spend the rest of his life in prison. The civil case was almost anticlimactic after the criminal convictions. The jury awarded Rebecca $2.1 million in damages compensation for the stolen money, for emotional distress, for the intentional infliction of suffering. Paul had to liquidate everything to pay it: his car, his investments, his half of the Aspen property, even his expensive watch collection that he'd valued so much. He ended up with nothing. Less than nothing, actually, since he still owed money even after everything was sold. Kristen took a plea deal. She testified against Paul in exchange for reduced charges and received 3 years probation with community service. Her legal career was over before it really started. The last I heard, she'd moved back to her hometown in Ohio, working at her father's insurance office. Her social media accounts deleted, her connection to Paul something she'd spend years trying to live down. But the legal outcomes weren't what mattered most to me. What mattered was watching Rebecca heal. It didn't happen overnight. There were nightmares in those first months, panic attacks when she saw men who resembled Paul, moments where the trauma would overwhelm her and she'd need to just sit quietly until the storm passed. She started therapy twice a week with a specialist in domestic abuse and PTSD. Slowly, session by session, she began to rebuild herself. Not into who she'd been before, Paul, that woman was gone, but into someone new, someone stronger and more aware of her own resilience. Rebecca started taking freelance graphic design work from home, small projects at first, then bigger contracts. Her talent hadn't disappeared during those years of isolation. If anything, having survived what she'd survived gave her work a depth it hadn't had before. Clients loved her designs, and word spread. Within 6 months, she was making more money than she'd made at her old job. Emma thrived in ways that constantly amazed me. Children are resilient in ways adults can't comprehend. She remembered nothing specific about living under that bridge, though her therapist said there might be buried trauma that could surface later. But for now, Emma was a happy, energetic 4-year-old who loved her preschool, adored her grandmother Catherine, and thought her mother was the strongest person in the world. Catherine became a constant presence in our lives. She'd meant what she said about wanting to be a real grandma. She came over twice a week to spend time with Emma, always bringing books or art supplies, never arriving empty-handed but never overcompensating with expensive gifts. She respected Rebecca's boundaries, never pushed for more access than Rebecca was comfortable giving. I watched Catherine transform from the quiet, diminished woman I'd met at family events into someone with purpose and genuine joy. Her divorce from Richard was finalized with a settlement that gave her financial security. She started volunteering with domestic violence organizations, using her experience and resources to help other women escape abusive situations. She told me once that testifying against Paul and Richard had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but also the most important. She said she'd spent 30 years being complicit through silence, and she was spending the rest of her life trying to balance that ledger. Rebecca and I grew closer than we'd ever been, not just as mother and daughter, but as 2 women who'd fought through something terrible together and come out the other side. She lived with me for 18 months while she rebuilt her finances and her confidence. When she finally moved into her own apartment, a bright, safe space she'd chosen and furnished herself, I helped her move in and felt such profound pride watching her carry boxers into her new beginning. The house Paul had forced her out of was sold. Rebecca used her share of the proceeds plus the civil settlement money to establish a trust fund for Emma's education and future. She also donated a substantial amount to organizations supporting homeless families, particularly mothers with young children. She told the director of one shelter that she'd lived under a bridge with her daughter, and she wanted to make sure other mothers in that situation had better options than she'd had. Sometimes people ask me if I think the punishment fit the crime. If 12 years in prison was too harsh, if we went too far in destroying Paul's life. I think about Emma sleeping on cold concrete. I think about Rebecca believing she'd been abandoned by everyone. I think about Paul laughing with his father about disposing of his wife properly. I think about him sipping champagne in Australia while his daughter went hungry. And I tell them that justice isn't always about being measured or proportional. Sometimes, justice means ensuring that cruelty has real consequences, that people who use power and privilege to hurt others don't get to walk away with a slap on the wrist and a lesson learned. Paul is 42 now. He'll be 54 when he's eligible for parole, if he gets it. His legal career is permanently over. His reputation destroyed, his father's legacy in ruin. The trust fund he destroyed his family for went to Richard's brother's children instead, exactly as the original terms specified would happen if Paul failed to produce a male heir by 35. He lost everything he valued for nothing. I'm not vindictive enough to say that brings me joy, but I'm honest enough to say it brings me peace. Today is Emma's 6th birthday. We're having a party at my house, Rebecca, Catherine, Emma's friends from school. Some of the neighbors who supported us through the trial. Emma is wearing a princess dress and laughing as she plays with her friends, completely unaware that 2 years ago she was living under a bridge. Rebecca is in my kitchen cutting cake, her smile genuine and reaching her eyes. Catherine is helping organize the kids for games, her own smile soft with contentment. And I'm standing here watching all of it, feeling something I didn't think I'd ever feel again after finding my daughter homeless. Hope, naive hope that ignores how dark things can get, but earned hope, built on the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, even when everything seems lost, there are still people willing to fight. There's still truth that can't be buried forever. There's still justice waiting to be claimed. Emma runs up to me and wraps her arms around my legs, telling me this is the best birthday ever. I pick her up and hold her close. This little girl who survived something no child should ever experience, who's growing up strong and loved and valued for exactly who she is. Rebecca catches my eye from across the room and mouths, "Thank you." But she has it backwards. I should be thanking her for surviving, for fighting back, for showing me and Emma and everyone watching that strength isn't about never being broken. It's about deciding to stand back up after being shattered. Someone asks me later, after the party winds down and most guests have left, what the most important lesson was from everything we went through. I think about that question while I watch Emma play with her birthday gifts, Catherine reading her a story, Rebecca cleaning up with that peaceful expression that tells me she's truly okay now. And I realize the answer is simple. The most important lesson is that the people who try to dispose of you, who treat you as worthless and expendable, who believe power and money make them untouchable, those people are wrong. They're wrong about your worth. They're wrong about their invincibility. And eventually, inevitably, they're wrong about getting away with it. Because somewhere, there's a mother who will fight for her daughter, a grandmother who will choose justice over legacy, a woman who will finally say enough. And when those forces align, when truth finds its voice and justice finds its moment, no amount of money or manipulation or privilege can stop what's coming. Paul learned that lesson in a courtroom while his own mother testified against him. Richard learned it in a prison cell where his family name means nothing. And Rebecca learned the most important version of it, that she was never as powerless as they tried to make her believe, that survival is its own form of victory, that standing up and telling the truth can bring down empires built on lies. Emma calls for me to come see something she's built with her blocks. I go to her, leaving behind my reflections about justice and consequences, focusing instead on this moment, this little girl who's safe, this daughter who's free, this life we've rebuilt from ruins. Tomorrow, Rebecca has a client meeting for a major design contract. Catherine is taking Emma to the park. I'm having lunch with Lisa to discuss a foundation we're starting to help other domestic abuse survivors navigate the legal system. We're all moving forward, building new lives, creating purposes from pain. Paul is sitting in his cell counting down the years until possible freedom that may never come. That's not revenge. That's just the natural consequence of treating people as disposable. And if there's anything I hope people take from our story, it's this: you can survive the worst thing you can imagine. You can stand up after being knocked down. You can fight back against people who seem untouchable. And you can rebuild a life that's not just surviving but actually worth living. We did it. Rebecca did it. And if you're reading this from a place of darkness, wondering if you can do it too, the answer is yes. You're stronger than you know, and you're worth fighting for. Always, this story has been one of survival, justice, and the power of standing up against cruelty. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I'm grateful. If you're watching from somewhere in the world facing your own battle, please know that you're not alone. I'd love to know where in the world you're hearing this story from. Drop a comment with your city or country. And if these stories of resilience and justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you never miss the next chapter of someone's fight for dignity and truth. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, no one gets to define your worth except you.